The room was tense, yet routine. Another day in court, another defendant. The officer stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, glancing occasionally at the people trickling in. Among them was a tall, composed black man dressed in a sharp civilian suit. He moved with quiet confidence, eyes steady, posture unshaken. There was something dignified in his presence, something that hinted at years of discipline and command. But none of that mattered to the officer standing guard. All he saw was just another black man waiting to be processed. As the man walked in, the officer let out a small, mocking chuckle. It wasn't loud enough to echo, but it was sharp enough to be noticed. He leaned slightly toward another officer and mumbled something under his breath, followed by another laugh. The general paused for a moment. Not long enough to make a scene, but just long enough to signal that he heard it. His face remained composed, but a flicker of discomfort passed through the air. Others may not have noticed, but he did. And so did the officer. The courtroom had no idea who had just walked in. No idea that the man standing before them had commanded troops overseas, had negotiated under pressure with foreign powers, had received medals for valor and integrity. In civilian clothes, without stars on his shoulders or ribbons on his chest, he was invisible to their respect. The uniform was gone, but the weight of his service was still there. And yet, all of that was dismissed with one smug glance and a careless laugh from a man in a badge. This moment wasn't just about one chuckle. It was about the years of subtle and overt disrespect that people of color, especially black men, face daily, regardless of their status or achievements. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of order, of justice. But for this officer, it was just another space where his assumptions went unchecked. He didn't see a leader, a protector of the nation, or a war hero. He saw what he wanted to see, a black man waiting to be judged. The officer's stance shifted slightly as the man approached the bench. Still unaware of who stood before him, the officer smirked again, letting his posture speak louder than words. It was a language the general knew all too well. He had faced it before, on foreign soil and at home. The assumption of inferiority. The casual dismissal. The narrowed eyes that always asked, "Who do you think you are?" There was no need for confrontation. The general didn't raise his voice or return the smirk. He simply stood, waiting, letting time do what time always does, reveal truth. But even in his silence, there was a quiet thunder. His every movement was deliberate. His every breath measured. He knew exactly what was happening. And he knew that sometimes, dignity is the loudest protest. Behind the officer's confidence was ignorance. And that ignorance was shared by several in the room. It was an ignorance built not on lack of intelligence, but on deeply rooted assumptions. Assumptions that told them a black man in a courtroom was more likely to be a criminal than a commander. Assumptions that told them they didn't need to look deeper. That smirk, that laugh, that glance, it wasn't personal to them. But to the man standing before them, it was a lifetime compressed into one moment. The officer, still unaware, returned to his clipboard, checking off names and whispering to a colleague. It was business as usual. But everything was about to change, and none of them were ready. This wasn't just any man. This wasn't a person you could scoff at and walk away from. And although the general hadn't revealed anything yet, the balance of power in that courtroom had already begun to shift. The air was different. The silence heavier. And behind that calm demeanor stood decades of leadership, sacrifice, and strength. Every second that passed in that room was a reminder of how quickly people judge, and how rarely they reflect. The officer had already formed his opinion, and that opinion was built on little more than skin tone and location. But he was about to learn that titles are not always visible, and power doesn't always wear a uniform. The general's silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. A strategy he'd used in war zones and negotiation rooms alike. Let them underestimate. Let them mock. Let them expose themselves. The courtroom, for now, remained still. The judge had not yet arrived. The clerk was still organizing papers. The officer leaned again on his heel, watching the general out of the corner of his eye. But what he didn't realize was that the story had already begun, and he was no longer in control of the narrative. He stood there, quiet and composed, yet to speak a word. The officer had already judged him. It was in his eyes, in his dismissive smirk, in the way he leaned against the courtroom wall as though he owned the space and everyone in it. The man before him didn't look like what he expected a general to look like. There were no polished medals, no starched uniform, no commanding presence announced by a deep voice or a burst of authority. He was simply a black man in a suit. And that was all the officer needed to assume everything he thought he knew. That assumption was built on years of conditioning. A system that teaches many to fear before they understand, to judge before they listen, to label before they look deeper. It wasn't just the officer's prejudice, it was a pattern passed down in glances, reinforced in news clips, baked into policies, whispered in locker rooms, and shouted in traffic stops. Stereotypes had taught him that a black man standing in court must have done something wrong, must be waiting for judgment, must be on the receiving end of power, not the one who once held it. The room wasn't full, but there were enough people to feel the unspoken tension. No one questioned the officer's posture, his casual laughter, his dismissiveness. It was normalized. Expected. The general, on the other hand, was used to this sort of welcome. It wasn't new to him. He had earned respect the hard way, through years of service and sacrifice, but still had to fight to be seen through a lens not clouded by bias. His medals had been saluted by presidents, but his skin was still questioned by strangers. He remembered moments like this all too well, walking into boardrooms where his rank had been second-guessed, stepping into press briefings where reporters had mistaken him for a security guard, flying in first-class cabins where flight attendants asked if he was in the wrong seat. The moment he took off the uniform, the assumptions returned. The same country he risked his life for still sometimes refused to see him beyond the color of his skin. Even in a courtroom, even in silence, even after all he had given, the fight to be seen continued. The officer's eyes spoke loudly. They scanned the general not with curiosity, but with certainty. The kind of certainty that only comes from unchecked bias. He believed he knew who this man was, what he was there for, what role he played in the narrative the officer had already written in his head. It was easier that way. Stereotypes reduce complexity. They simplify the world into characters that fit neatly into expectations. But real people, like the general, defy those roles. They challenge the script and make the audience uncomfortable. And that's what the officer couldn't yet see. The discomfort that would come from realizing he had misread the entire situation. That he had misjudged a man whose leadership had saved lives. That he had sneered at someone who had once stood before nations, representing the very ideals that badge was meant to protect. The irony was sharp, but the general remained composed. He had nothing to prove to this man. But he knew that soon, the truth would unfold on its own. Around them, the court's machinery moved slowly. Files shuffled. People whispered. But the most powerful dynamic in the room was invisible. It was the gap between appearance and reality. Between perception and truth. Between the officer's stereotype and the general's story. That gap was where prejudice lived, and where justice was so often lost. The officer didn't need a reason to smirk. His assumptions gave him permission. They told him it was okay. They told him he was in control. They told him the man standing there wasn't important. But every assumption he made was a lie. The general had broken every mold, exceeded every expectation, shattered every glass ceiling built to hold him back. And still, none of that was enough to stop a laugh. That laugh wasn't just disrespect, it was a symptom. A symptom of how deeply these stereotypes run. A decorated war hero could still be mocked because his story didn't match what the world expected. That was the cost of invisibility. Of being seen only through the lens of race and not the reality of character. The courtroom was still, but the weight of that moment lingered. The general knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every young black man who walks into a space and is told without words that he doesn't belong. It was about every person whose truth is buried under assumption. The silence between them now was louder than any words. One man stood in quiet strength. The other in loud ignorance. And the space between them told a story all its own. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was intentional, purposeful, and loud in its own way. While the officer smirked and whispered, while others in the courtroom barely looked twice at the man in the suit, the general stood motionless, calm, and completely composed. Years of military service had taught him how to command without shouting, how to lead without spectacle, and how to demand respect without even opening his mouth. It wasn't arrogance, it was presence. The kind of presence that fills a room slowly, making itself known not through volume but through quiet strength. There's a unique power in stillness. Not the kind born of hesitation or fear, but the kind honed over decades of discipline and decision-making under pressure. The general didn't need to engage with the disrespect. He didn't need to respond to the officer's smirk or prove anything to anyone. He had nothing to prove. He had led battalions, delivered orders in chaos, and stood face to face with danger. Compared to that, a courtroom full of assumptions was just another battlefield, one he knew how to navigate with control and dignity. Every small action he took was deliberate, the way he held his folder, the way his eyes scanned the room without urgency, the way he stood with both feet planted firmly, not just physically but symbolically. He was grounded, and nothing the officer said or implied could shake that. The general had encountered worse, and he had long ago made the choice not to let moments like this define him. His silence wasn't passivity. It was a decision to conserve power until the right moment came. That moment was coming, and he knew it. The courtroom continued to move around him. Clerks prepared their paperwork, lawyers reviewed their notes, and spectators whispered behind benches. But the officer kept looking back at him, curious, perhaps slightly annoyed by the man's unbothered demeanor. There was no reaction, no return of the smirk, no confrontation. Just calm. That lack of emotional response can sometimes be unsettling to those who expect drama, who expect to provoke. The officer wanted to feel superior, to enjoy the power imbalance he thought he had created. But without a reaction, that imbalance felt shaky. Respect isn't demanded through shouting or arguing. It's earned through consistency, composure, and the ability to carry your truth even when others refuse to see it. The general knew this. He had walked into rooms where no one looked like him, where people had doubted his qualifications before he'd even spoken. But every time, he'd let his work, his knowledge, and his poise speak for him. It was never easy, but it had always been effective. People remember quiet strength. It lingers. It challenges their assumptions without them even realizing it. The officer's eyes kept drifting toward him, trying to read him, trying to figure out what was off. There was something different about this man, but he couldn't quite name it. He didn't carry himself like someone afraid of the legal system. He didn't shift nervously or look around for reassurance. Instead, he waited. And that waiting wasn't anxious, it was confident. A man who knows his truth doesn't panic when others don't recognize it. He simply waits for the moment when it becomes undeniable. What the officer didn't realize was that he had already lost control of the situation. His smirk and mocking comments had bounced off someone immune to such things. The power he thought he had, the ability to humiliate, to diminish, had no effect here. And when power fails to land, it disappears. The general had flipped the dynamic without saying a single word. He had reclaimed his space through stillness, through presence, through an unshakable sense of who he was. In a world that often demands loud responses to loud insults, there's something deeply disarming about choosing silence. It forces people to sit with their assumptions. It robs them of the satisfaction of control. The general had mastered this art. Not because he was passive, but because he understood when to speak and when to let the silence do the speaking for him. His silence now wasn't emptiness, it was full of memory, of pride, of patience. It was the silence of someone who had endured and succeeded despite all the odds stacked against him. That kind of presence is rare. And when it enters a room, it shifts the atmosphere, even if no one can quite explain why. People start noticing. They sit a little straighter. They wonder who this man is. The courtroom, still unaware of who he truly was, had already begun to feel that shift. The officer couldn't define it, but he felt it. His gaze lingered longer. His smirk faded slightly. His mind started questioning what his instincts had already assumed. And all the general had done was stand in silence, commanding the room without needing to raise his voice. The moment was quiet, but it carried weight. The courtroom had settled into a lull, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, though no one knew exactly what. The officer, still resting in his self-assuredness, glanced at the man once more, the man he had scoffed at, mocked under his breath, dismissed without a second thought. But everything was about to change. The general, still calm and composed, reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was not hurried, not dramatic, just a quiet, deliberate action that immediately caught the attention of those closest to him. There was something purposeful in how he moved. The phone wasn't just a device in his hand, it was a key. A tool. And as he began to dial, the air in the room started to shift. The officer's smirk slowly faded, curiosity creeping in to replace his earlier mockery. The general lifted the phone to his ear, exchanged a few quiet words, and ended the call just as calmly as he had made it. Nothing about the moment was loud, but it sent a ripple through the space, one that would soon become a wave. Not long after, a buzz of motion started near the courtroom entrance. A man in uniform walked in, not a local police officer, but someone from the military. Sharp. Stern. The kind of presence that changes the rhythm of a room simply by arriving. Behind him, another figure entered, and then another. It was clear these weren't random visitors. These were people with purpose, with authority, with rank. The courtroom staff looked up. The clerk paused. Even the judge, moments from entering, seemed to sense the shift unfolding just outside the frame of normalcy. The officer stiffened. His casual stance now seemed misplaced, almost awkward. He straightened up slightly, watching as the figures approached the man he had once dismissed. They didn't walk past him. They didn't ask for directions. They came directly to the general, greeting him with a quiet, "Sir," that cut through every assumption that had filled the room moments before. The officer's eyes widened, not in theatrical shock, but in dawning realization. This wasn't just a man in a suit. This wasn't just another black face in a courtroom. This was someone powerful, someone respected, someone far above the rank the officer had assumed. The phone call had been short, but its impact was massive. It had connected threads that no one else in the room could see. A network of command, of loyalty, of institutional respect that the officer had never imagined existed in this man's world. The general had spoken to someone, not for attention, not to create a scene, but simply because it was time. Time to pull back the curtain. Time to let the truth be seen, not through arguments, but through presence, protocol, and quiet authority. The room began to respond. Small murmurs among the spectators. A shifting of posture among the court officials. Even the judge, now seated at the bench, glanced more than once at the gathering near the rear of the courtroom. The general hadn't said a single word about his rank, hadn't demanded recognition. He had simply made a call. And in doing so, he had unraveled every stereotype that had been placed on him from the moment he entered the room. The officer, now visibly uneasy, stepped back slightly, unsure whether to approach or remain where he was. The laughter, the smug confidence, gone. In their place was uncertainty. Regret, maybe. Certainly confusion. He had made a mistake, and he knew it. He had judged someone far above his station without knowing a single fact about him. He had relied on bias, on assumptions, on appearances. And now, all of those assumptions had crumbled in front of his eyes. But the general didn't gloat. He didn't react. He continued to stand quietly as the military official spoke with him, offering brief updates and respectful nods. There was no show, no vengeance, no anger. Only composure. Only that same presence that had unsettled the officer long before he realized who this man was. The difference now was that everyone else could see it too. The room, once filled with dismissiveness, was now filled with something else entirely: respect. Unspoken, but palpable. The phone call had done more than summon support. It had exposed truth. Not just the truth of identity, but the truth of perception. It revealed how shallow assumptions can be, how easily respect is withheld based on race or appearance, and how quickly those assumptions unravel when faced with reality. The officer wasn't the only one reevaluating. Many in the room, consciously or not, were now reflecting on what they had assumed too. The courtroom hadn't just shifted physically, it had shifted morally, psychologically. The air had thickened with realization. The courtroom, which only moments ago had felt like a space dominated by routine judgments and silent assumptions, was now humming with the quiet energy of awareness. The officer who had dismissed the man in the suit now stood still, no longer leaning back in arrogance but forward in discomfort. The smirk he had worn so confidently had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that betrayed his growing unease. The general remained composed, but the room around him had transformed. Every eye was now drawn to him, not out of suspicion, but out of sudden recognition. The uniformed officials who had arrived after the phone call stood respectfully at the general's side. Their posture, tone, and words all made one thing unmistakably clear: this man was someone important. Someone who had earned their reverence. Someone who didn't need to announce his authority because it had already been built, brick by brick, over years of leadership, sacrifice, and service. The officer's eyes darted between the general and the military figures flanking him. His mind raced to piece together what was happening, but the picture had already come into focus. He had underestimated a man who outranked him not just by status, but by character. The general didn't need to turn toward the officer. His silence said more than any confrontation ever could. He had let the truth reveal itself naturally, and now it stood there in the open, undeniable and unshakable. Others in the courtroom began to shift in their seats. Some exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to express admiration or regret. The judge's tone, once indifferent, took on a note of caution and curiosity. The clerk, who had barely acknowledged the man before, now addressed him with professional respect. The general had not changed, but the perception of him had. And that was the most revealing part of all. The officer looked around, seeking validation, but found none. His earlier confidence had turned into isolation. The few colleagues nearby avoided his eyes, unwilling to associate themselves with what now looked like a grave misstep. The reality of what he had done began to settle in, not just the disrespect, but the careless speed with which he had judged. He had assumed so much, based on so little. Now that the truth had emerged, the memory of his behavior felt heavier, sharper. He could not erase the laugh, the whispered joke, or the condescending tone. They were etched into the moment, visible to everyone who had seen them unfold. The military presence was not loud or imposing. They didn't shout or make declarations. They didn't need to. Their mere presence validated the general's identity in a way that dismantled every assumption that had been made about him. One of them quietly passed a file to the general, who reviewed it with the same calm precision he had carried since walking into the room. The officer watched, not understanding the contents, but knowing instinctively that it was something important. Something he should have respected from the start. Whispers moved through the courtroom like wind. People were asking each other the same question: who is he? And slowly, as the answers began to circulate, the mood shifted from curiosity to admiration. This wasn't just a decorated officer. This was a man who had led in combat, made decisions that changed lives, earned stars and medals that few ever see. The courtroom had treated him like a number, like a defendant, like a name on a list. But now, Stripped of the uniform that usually signaled his importance, he had still managed to command the entire room. The officer could feel his mistake tightening around him. It wasn't just about protocol, it was about something deeper. About the way society teaches people to see black men through a narrow lens. About the comfort with which authority figures assume the worst. About the layers of conditioning that make bias feel natural and even justified. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. No one said it aloud, but the officer could feel the weight of it in every glance now turned toward him. He had judged wrongly, and now everyone could see it. The general finally spoke, not in anger or pride, but in the clear, steady tone of someone who knew who he was. He didn't raise his voice, didn't direct his words at the officer, yet the message landed exactly where it needed to. Every syllable was a reminder that dignity can't be erased by ignorance, and that respect is not something to be requested, it's something to be recognized. The officer lowered his gaze, the gap between who he thought the general was and who the general truly is becoming too wide to ignore. The courtroom had returned to silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't the usual stillness of legal procedure or the polite hush of routine. This was the kind of silence that comes after something undeniable has been revealed, when assumptions have been shattered and truths laid bare. The man standing in the middle of the room, once quietly dismissed, was now the quiet center of respect and attention. The officer who had laughed, who had judged with his eyes and not his mind, now stood motionless, face flushed, posture unsure. The shift was complete, but its echo would remain far longer than the moment itself. What had just happened was more than a personal reckoning, it was a lesson in identity, perception, and power. A reminder that status and value aren't always visible on the surface, and that judgment based on appearance is not just wrong, but dangerous. The general had walked into the room carrying his identity within him, not on his shoulders in the form of stripes or medals, but within his bearing, his experience, and his discipline. None of that had been visible to those who didn't bother to look beyond skin color or dress. And yet it was all there, waiting to be seen. The courtroom had become a mirror, reflecting not just the story of one man, but the biases and expectations of many. Every person watching had to confront what they had assumed. Even those who hadn't laughed or whispered had likely categorized him, mentally assigning him a place in the courtroom hierarchy. It's an unconscious process, taught through years of images, stories, headlines, and habits. Black man in a courtroom? Probably the accused. Probably someone here to receive orders, not give them. That mental shortcut is common. But it's also corrosive. The general's presence challenged that shortcut. Without ever needing to raise his voice, he had flipped the script entirely. He had exposed the gap between how people are perceived and who they truly are. And in doing so, he had highlighted something many choose to ignore, the injustice of assumption. If someone of his rank, someone of his achievements, someone who had given so much to the very system that now disrespected him, could be reduced in a single glance, what did that say about the system itself? What did that say about how many others were treated the same way, without the chance or authority to reveal the truth? The officer, by now, was visibly humbled. No one had scolded him out loud, but the lesson was undeniable. His reaction had been instinctual, automatic, a product of a worldview shaped by stereotypes. He hadn't thought about it. He hadn't hesitated. That was the problem. And that's the broader truth the general's presence had illuminated. Racism and bias aren't always loud or violent. Sometimes, they're quiet. They hide in jokes, in glances, in body language, in silence. They live in unchecked moments, moments that pass quickly for the person committing them but linger deeply for the person receiving them. Respect isn't about reacting to uniforms or titles. True respect is about recognizing humanity, seeing beyond surface impressions, and choosing to treat others with dignity regardless of what they appear to be. The general had spent his life earning respect the hard way, by fighting for a country that hadn't always fought for him, by rising through the ranks in a system where few looked like him, by carrying the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. He had proven himself over and over again, not just to institutions, but to history itself. And yet here he was, still needing to remind a courtroom that he mattered. That he deserved to be seen, not just looked at. That he deserved the benefit of the doubt, not the burden of assumption. This was the reality for many, and his story had just brought it into the light. It wasn't just a story of one man being judged too quickly, it was a reflection of a much larger pattern. A culture that still clings to surface-level assessments, that still fears what it doesn't understand, that still denies respect until it's forced to give it. The lesson didn't end with the phone call. It didn't end when the military officials arrived. It lived in the silence that followed, in the shifting posture of the people in the room, in the humbled expression of a man who had made a mistake. It lingered in the awareness that had settled over the crowd. A quiet, unmistakable awareness that what they had just witnessed wasn't just a dramatic moment, but a confrontation with their own biases. The general remained composed, his presence unchanged. But everything else had changed. The courtroom would never forget what it had seen. The people in it would remember the stillness, the phone call, the transformation. And most of all, they would remember the truth that had risen quietly, steadily, and without apology.